Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be discussing a solved murder case, and this case all started from two people meeting online, which quickly spiraled into a murder case. This is one of those cases that is very creepy, it's very disturbing, but I think it's extremely important to talk about because we don't realise how much danger there is on the internet, and unfortunately situations like this can happen. So it's always important to stay safe online and really think about who you're speaking to. So with that being said, let's get into today's case. So this is Thomas Montgomery. He was a 46-year-old family man from Buffalo, New York. He was married to his wife Sydney for 17 years and he had two daughters. Now on the outskirts, everyone looked at Tom as a very happy family man. He had two beautiful daughters and he was very engaged. He was actually their swim team teacher and he was even a Sunday school teacher and was actively in their lives and supporting them for school and any other activities that they enjoyed. He also worked at a local factory and he had been there for 12 years. He was just your typical middle-aged man with a balding head and a bit of a dad bod, and everyone really liked him and there wasn't really a bad word to be said about Tom. But in reality, Tom was hiding a dark secret. So it was May 2005 and Tom decided to log on to a teen chat website called Pogo, as you do. And while doing so, he received a message that would change his life forever. Now, Tom's online name was Marine Sniper, and this was because he had formerly served in the Marines as a young man. So he just called himself Marine Sniper as his online name. So in May 2005, Tom received a message from a woman named Tallhotblond. That was her screen name, but she then introduced herself as Jessi. She was an 18-year-old high school senior from West Virginia, and she was currently in high school. She was a softball champion and she was really into sports. She started to open up and talk about her life with Tom. Now, of course, this is really strange. She's 18 and Tommy is 46 years old, but he didn't just click out of the chat like any other married man would. He entertained this chat and then he started to tell Jessi about himself, but not himself in the present, about himself 25 years earlier. He introduced himself as Tom, an 18-year-old military marine who was stationed in Iraq. He just thought that he'd have a bit of fun for a few days and talk to this young girl, and then he would obviously stop talking to her and just carry on talking to adults. But things only escalated from there. And they really started to hit it off. I mean, they were talking constantly, day and night, until 2, 3 in the morning sometimes. Then a few weeks into their chat, Jessi started sending very provocative photos to Tom, and these were very graphic. She would send him photos of her in bikinis, of her in underwear, photos of her in her sports gear for school, and she really kind of smothered him. He claims that he never asked her for any of these, but she just was very full on and just decided to send him all of these provocative photos. So of course Jessi then asked to see Tom, and that is when he panicked and decided to send her a photo of him 30 years prior. He described himself as having red hair, 6 feet tall inches, big muscles, and he said that he had 2.5 million in the bank and a 9-inch. So he was really lying to this girl, and he was basically describing himself in some ways, but 30 years prior. And as I said, he just thought he'd do this for a few days, have a bit of fun, but this sadly did not happen. They continued to talk day in, day out for 4, 5, 6 months, and Jessi would actually start sending him underwear, red underwear in the mail, and sending him necklaces that were carved as Jessi and Tom, love heart necklaces, just all sorts of stuff, and it was as if they were really invested in one another. So the thing is, Tom actually, in a sense, was telling the truth, but he wasn't talking about the Thomas Montgomery he was now. He was talking about the young Marine buff soldier he was 30 years prior. And he actually started telling her true stories about his time in Iraq and things about his family, and he really sort of went back into that person that he was years prior. So I think on some level he didn't really think he was lying. He was reliving this fantasy that simply did not exist, and he even described his and Jessi's relationship as like a drug. He just couldn't switch off from it. They even started saying "I love you" to one another and had very explicit phone sex, and their conversations got very, very graphic. One day, Tom even proposed to Jessi online. She said yes, but they had never even met. Then, 8 months later, on January the 2nd, 2006, Tom really started to lose it, and he wrote a note to himself that was later found, which said, Tom Montgomery, 46 years old, ceases to exist and is a battle-scarred Marine, 18-year-old, and he will be moving to West Virginia to be with the love of his life. He literally wrote this note to himself. I don't know why. That is just so, so weird, but he did. And then one day things changed. In February of 2006, nearly a year after they had met online, Tom's wife started to become very suspicious of his constant screen time, as you would, and she really wanted to find out what he was doing so much on the family computer. And then one day, one of Tom's daughters was actually on the computer, and up popped a message from Jessi, or Tallhotblond as she would have seen it as. And she obviously told her mother immediately, and that is when Cindy confronted her husband. She also, weeks later, found a package which contained Jessi's red thong in. He told her to let it go. She confronted him, but he just blocked her off and said, "Stay out of my business." But Sydney was not going to leave it there. This is when Sydney decided to write a letter to Jessi exposing her husband. She said, quote, "Let me introduce you to these people. The man in the centre is Tom, my husband since 1989. He is 46 years old. These are our two daughters. Do not trust words on a computer so easily. Let this go." End quote. And a photo of their family was attached. So Jessi was heartbroken when she received this letter, and she was actually quite disgusted because Tom wasn't this 18-year-old buff Marine that he said he was, and she had obviously shared very explicit photos of herself, so she was heartbroken. But then Jessi sought revenge on Tom, and that is when she decided to contact another gentleman who was on the site, and his name was Barrett. He was a 22-year-old machinist who also worked part-time at the factory with Tom. So they were colleagues and they were actually pretty good friends. But they both used to talk on this website, and they would play poker together online. So she had naturally just found his name, and his username was Beefcake. And so she decided to get revenge by contacting Brian. She first asked him if all of this was true, which he confirmed, and then she basically just started flirting with Brian, and she actually became very attracted to him. They were obviously a much similar age. He was 22 years old, she was 18, so they just started to hit it off really. But of course a lot of this was to make Tom jealous. So Brian actually went to work and was boasting of his online relationship with Jessi. Obviously he was a young man and they tend to do that, so he just basically started going on about this at work, and this really infuriated Tom. She then started to send all these photos that she had once sent to Tom to Brian, and she basically told Brian how she felt about him, and they continued talking for months and months. Jessi then took it a step further and encouraged Brian to start trashing Tom online. So he did, and they both started to call him a predator and a pervert online to all of their online friends and all across this teen chat to make everyone aware of who Tom really was. And of course this only made him more and more angry. But then Jessi really changed her mind, and she then started to actually go back to Tom and started saying things like she misses him and she wishes he was that 18-year-old Marine. So at this point, Tom had felt like he'd won the jackpot. He was being accepted by the 47-year-old dad of two, and this beautiful 18-year-old girl still wanted him. But unfortunately, she was just toying between him and Brian, and she really just wanted all the guys to fight over her, and she wanted to get a rise out of Tom. She would boast about her relationship with Brian online, and she would rub it in Tom's face, and he just completely lost it. One day, Brian and Jessi actually arranged to meet up, and Brian went into work and told all his colleagues that he was going to be meeting this beautiful blonde that he had met, and he was going to drive down to West Virginia where she lived. And obviously Tom overheard this, and he was absolutely gobsmacked because he had been talking to this beautiful 18-year-old blonde for nearly a year, and he was going to lose to this 22-year-old guy that he worked with, and he was not going to let that happen. That is when Tom started to get extremely threatening. He would send messages to Jessi saying, "Brian will pay in blood, and you have done what I feared most, turned my heart ice cold." On Sunday, 17th of September 2006, Brian Barrett was found shot dead in his truck outside of the car park where he worked. A co-worker of his had seen his truck on Sunday and wondered why it was still there. He went over, and on closer inspection he found Brian in the driver's seat, and he had been struck 3 times from close range, 1 in the neck and 2 in the arms. And he was shot by that of a military rifle. When police turned up to the heartbreaking scene, they had discovered that it seems that Brian had actually been shot on Friday the 15th, just after his shift. He finished at around 9:30 to 10 p.m. and he was walking to his car, and it is presumed that he was shot at 10 p.m. that night. No one had discovered Brian's body for 2 days. When police arrived at the scene, they immediately called and brought in co-workers of the company that Brian and Tom both worked at to see what could have happened and who would have done this to him. And they all immediately told the police that there was no doubt in their minds that this was Thomas Montgomery. They were all very familiar with this cyber love triangle that was going on because, as I said, they would regularly talk about it at work. So there was no doubt in their mind, and they had no reservations about telling the police that this was Thomas Montgomery. Once Brian's families were alerted of his tragic death, that is when the police decided to look into this more, just to back up what their co-workers said and make sure they had the correct information. So they found the complete transcript of the conversations that were had between the 3 people, and that is when they immediately began to panic because they had strong suspicions that Tom was then on his way to West Virginia to harm Jessi, because they thought if he's done this to Brian, then he may be going after Jessi next. So Jessi lived in Oak Hill, West Virginia, and the police arrived at her neighborhood at around 6 p.m. that evening. They knocked, and Jessi's mother, Mary Sheila, opened the door. They wanted to speak to Jessi. They asked where she was, and they explained that there had been a murder and they were concerned for Jessi's safety. That is when Jessi's mother broke down in hysterics. Her eyes filled with tears and she completely broke down. And what she told police was that Jessi had never spoken to Tom Montgomery. She had. The entire time, Mary Sheila, 46-year-old mother of 18-year-old Jessi, was posing as her own daughter online and seducing Tom and many other men without her daughter ever knowing. She purposely took pictures of her own daughter without her even knowing. She took pictures of her in her underwear, and she even took a video camera and videoed up her own daughter's skirt, which is just absolutely sick. She would do this on a regular basis and pose as her 18-year-old daughter as a way to lure men in. When the news of what Mary Sheila had done, her husband divorced her immediately. Her daughter Jessi was obviously devastated. Her and her mother were actually extremely close, so it might seem like, oh, okay, maybe her mother had some issues and they didn't get on. Not that that's an excuse, but obviously that wasn't the case, and they actually really got on, and they were really close, and they would regularly go and get their nails done and go out for coffee. And Jessi really confided in her mum, and she really loved her, so this was an absolute shock. She made the difficult decision to completely cut her mother off, which I think is the right thing to do. She immediately moved in with other relatives, and she literally never spoke to her mother again, to my knowledge. But Mary still refused to take responsibility, stating that she was just having fun and she never meant for anyone to get hurt. When the news was broken to Tom that he was not speaking to the beautiful 18-year-old Jessi, but instead her 46-year-old mother, he went completely silent and the colour drained from his face. Can you imagine? Not that killing someone over anyone is ever okay, but can you imagine how stupid he must have felt for taking an innocent man's life over someone he never even met, who wasn't even who they said they were? I just can't. Thomas Montgomery conveniently denied having any involvement in Brian's murder, but the evidence was just too much, and it was too big to be a coincidence. They even found his DNA on a peach pit that he had tossed aside after committing the murder. He pled not guilty to the murder of Brian Barrett, but he was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Investigators said his motive was jealousy. His wife also divorced him. Now, sadly, Mary was never charged with any form of crime because technically she didn't do anything wrong, which is just crazy. Even though her selfish actions caused a young man to die and broke up 3 separate families. Unfortunately, it's not a crime to lie, and it's not a crime to pretend to be someone else over the internet, or especially not in the state of New York. Brian's family petitioned to make a law that would make online catfishing illegal in New York, but there is no update on if that went through or not. Brian Barrett was a 22-year-old man aspiring to be an industrial arts teacher. He was an accomplished high school athlete who coached Little League all summer and helped his father coach soccer. He was described as quiet, a nice kid and a gentleman. No one could say a bad word about him. Absolutely heartbreaking and devastating. This poor man lost his life and his family will always have to live with that. But I'd be really interested to see what you think of this case. Do you think that Mary should have been held accountable and received some sort of criminal action for what she'd done? It sounds crazy that she's just able to carry on living her life while this many people have been affected by what she's done. But is this enough? She lost her husband, she lost her daughter, she lost her whole family. They all disowned her. So is this punishment enough for her to learn and live with for the rest of her life? I'd be really interested to see what you have to say. I know this was a bit of a different one, but I just think, as I said, it is so important to be aware of who you're talking to online, because this sort of thing is real. This can happen, and this did happen. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you have any suggestions at all, please comment them below and I'll be more than happy to look into them. Thank you. Bye.